To understand better how bullying may specifically affect your refugee clients, it's important to look at the definition of what it means to be a refugee. The 1951 Refugee Convention established the following definition. Refugees flee their country of origin due to a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and social group. The persecution is at the hands of the government or a third party that the government is unable or unwilling to control. These categories are purposely broad so they can be inclusive of different forms of discrimination. So, for example, in 2012, sexual orientation and discrimination was expounded upon much further as being part of one of these categories. Now let's take a look at the pyramid of bullying, which includes various forms of discrimination. So I picked just visual because it highlights different types of bullying. I didn't pick it to necessarily imply that there is a hierarchy in these different forms and that we should, kind of look at bias or prejudice and really overlook it and say, well, at least bias or prejudice, it's not as bad as genocide. If that's the case, that's a very low bar that we're setting for ourselves. I think it's more important for us when we look at this visual to see how these different categories overlap and how they build off of one another. In some of the stories I've already shared, you can see how bias is intersected with individual acts of discrimination or prejudice. You've even seen how some bullying turned violent when it came to threats or physical assaults. What's critical to keep in mind for refugees is that they or their communities have experienced genocide or bias-motivated violence. It is part of the very definition of what it means to be a refugee. So we need to keep in mind how things from bias, prejudice, and discrimination can also trigger experiences and fears in our refugee clients of genocide and violence. I remember one Muslim refugee youth where one of the first questions he asked me upon arrival was, "Noof, is it safe here for Muslims?" Knowing that where he came from it wasn't, and that being Muslim could get you killed. Now in the United States, where he came to seek refuge, he is also confronted by stories of Muslims and other minorities being shot in their houses of worship or on the streets. Similarly, for an African client, where youth may taunt them and say, go back to the jungle, we have to think, what do those comments evoke for them? What was their migratory path leaving their country? What were the dangers? For refugees who are taunted for their small build, to what degree is that a consequence of genetics, and to what degree is it a consequence of malnourishment in the pre-migration or migration phase? When girls are having their clothing torn off, such as their hijab, or when people are making lewd sexual comments towards them, is that invoking fears and experience of sexual-based violence? These are all questions that we have to be very aware of when we're contextualizing bullying within a refugee context. And to go back to our conversation about identity-based bullying, when one refugee is targeted, all refugees can feel threatened because that is precisely how violence started for so many refugees back home. So as you can see, when we talk about bullying and discrimination, we can't separate it from mental health issues and acculturation difficulties. All of these different concerns, they're all working together. None of it exists in a vacuum. And so we want to think about how these different spheres are influencing youth while at the same time keeping in mind that these are the same youth that are experiencing some of the more, quote, normal developmental hurdles of what it means to be an adolescent, what it means to be a youth. So we have to place all of these into conversation with each other and see how they're impacting each other. For example, mental health. Kids who are bullied can find the experiences to be very traumatic, especially when it invokes trauma of persecution in one's home country. Youth can also experience depression, anxiety, increased feelings of sadness and loneliness, changes in sleep and eating patterns, loss of interest in activities that they used to enjoy. Grief and loss. We don't always think about this when we think about bullying, but it's really an important topic to consider. It's important to note how refugee youth may be grieving for different things. So for example, upon coming to the United States, they felt like the persecution would come to an end and that they would be safe. But when they are bullied again here in the United States, there is a loss of that perceived sense of safety, control, peace. There is grief over family members who may be experiencing bullying. There's also a loss of significance, feeling that they don't matter to anyone, they don't belong anywhere, they don't fit in. So some of our different refugee clients, they might also be experiencing acculturation stressors, and bullying can exacerbate some of those stressors. So, for example, learning English, speaking with an accent, and and again, going back to the idea of what acculturation means. So sometimes the youth that we're working with, they'll have difficulty adapting to certain U.S. cultural norms. They'll have difficulty maintaining their culture of origin. They may be conflicting with family members on cultural adjustment and adjusting in different ways and in different times and places. And again, just to remember that we have to be mindful of the language that we're using when we're talking about acculturation stress with our students. We don't want to imply that students should be ashamed of their ethnic identities or their religious identities or their race or their sexual or their gender orientation. I mean, all of these things. So again, we need to be mindful that we are being very inclusive, and that differences are not deficiencies, but that they can be strengths.